We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
Back to school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop tax-free August 2nd through 6th and save up to 70% off the latest school styles. The best of apparel, footwear, accessories, and more. Save at Nike Factory Store, American Eagle, Gap Outlet, Crocs, Under Armour, Banana Republic Factory, and hundreds more. There's always something happening. Discover the latest fun and events all season long. Tanger Outlets, your savings destination.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Archaeoanimals, the podcast all about zooarchaeology. I'm Alex Fitzpatrick, and with me as always,
Simona Falanga.
And this is the second installment. I mean, I could just say episode, but I feel like installment gives it more gravitas. Yeah, this is the second installment of our mini-series that we've been doing, which we started last month with the episode on early prehistoric. And now we are doing Time Warped Part 2, the Zooarchaeology of the Later Prehistoric.
We are indeed talking about the Later Bronze Age and the Iron Age, mostly in Britain. I think, as we've mentioned in the previous episode, this mini-series might end up being a little bit Britain-centric, or even England-centric almost for the most part. But I do promise we will remedy that in a later mini-series that we're working on. So, stay tuned.
Yeah, I mean, I think we kind of had that disclaimer for all of our episodes because, as we've said many times, me and Simona are both based here in Britain. We do mainly British archaeology, so we're a little biased, I feel like.
Yeah, I think so far it's been mostly England with a touch of Scotland here and there.
Yeah, just a dab, a little tiny dab of Scotland. Simona said we will branch out a bit more, but obviously, you do what you know. And I think some of us know too much than others, I feel like, about certain, periods of time.
It's a good occasion to learn.
Wait until the next episode. Oh boy. Oh boy.
I'd like to say for the next episode, Alex will solely take charge of all the notes and the research and the discussion of the Romano-British period.
I'm just not going to be here. It's just going to be Simona. There's no point in me even showing up. Anyway.
Well, you can just be there throwing hashtags, like Chunky Toes and all the other ones we got going.
I think that's producer Tristan's job. Let's not summon him. I was just gonna say it's like Beetlejuice, except he'll just come in. Anyway, back on track.
A brief overview of the time periods that we're going to discuss. The late Bronze Age, at least in Britain, goes from about 1000 to 700 BC, and the Iron Age goes from there all the way to 100 AD, which kind of makes it overlap with the Romano-British period, which formally begins with the Roman invasion of Britain in 59 AD. As you may suspect by the names, these phases are characterized by the use of bronze and iron, respectively.
No.
Which... Yeah, right. Of course, the Bronze Age is when iron was used, and in the Iron Age is when bronze was used, yeah?
Yeah.
Which brings us again to the other disclaimer that I think we'll be doing for every single installment of this mini-series, that, of course, these terms, Bronze Age, Iron Age, or, are a bit, they're conventional terms which make it easier for us to identify, a particular time period that we're talking about. So if I say Bronze Age, that I mean sort of around from this time to this time before present, roughly. But of course, they are, as you'd expect, very arbitrary in nature. So it's not like in whenever the Bronze Age formally begins, some 3000 BC, someone just went, "Oh, what is this? It's bronze. We do bronze now. It's what we do." Or then, 59 AD, the Romans invade, and then just everyone wakes up one morning and goes, "Oh, our." It's there are changes that would have happened over a long period of time, and there will be, overlaps between time periods. But again, so like while these catch-all terms won't be 100% accurate, they really help us to sort of pinpoint what we're talking about in a way that is direct. So all that to say is that these are useful terms, but please do acknowledge their limitations.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important thing to bring up every episode, which I guess if you're someone who is binging all of these episodes at once, I'm sorry that you're going to have to hear this every single time. But like, I think it's important just because, you know, that's something in archaeology, I think, at least for people who are outside of the field, maybe don't really consider. And to be honest, I feel like in some respects, even I kind of forget sometimes, like, oh, there is overlap, especially as someone who works predominantly in the later prehistoric period. It gets very tricky. Like you said, you know, we do technically overlap the Roman British period. And so you kind of get this weird back and forth, especially when you're working in sites that kind of have that overlap over what's happening, especially because I feel like there's, I guess, not stereotypes, but, you know, there's very distinct ideas people have of, oh, this is the Iron Age and this is the Romano period. You know what I mean?
Yeah, because also like not everything would change overnight, and also some things would not change at all.
Yeah.
Because even like we'll discuss it in the next episode more than anything. But even though, okay, the Romans were in charge, again, not everyone Romanized and became Roman. Like, you know, the common people will just go, oh, so this bloke's in charge now. Yeah, I'll just go on with my daily life as I always have done, if you know what I mean.
No, yeah, exactly. And of course, we also don't see things so cut and dry in archaeology, even though I would love it to be that way. You know, you don't necessarily, especially if anyone who's listening to this isn't an archaeologist, unfortunately, we don't get to just go to a site and be like, okay, so this graphic layer here is clearly just the Iron Age, and then right over it is just the Roman period, you know? Like, it just unfortunately doesn't work that way. So there is a kind of weird, like, I hate to say it, it's a liminal space of time where you're kind of in the Iron Age, you're kind of not, you're kind of in the late Bronze Age. You know,
it's a transitional period.
Ooh, transitional.
Everyone loves a transitional site.
Yes, it definitely doesn't make my life a nightmare, especially when you're working in something like zooarchaeology, where certain animals don't appear until certain times. So you're not really sure if you just made a huge discovery about an early introduction of a species or someone's messed up.
Well, I don't know, if you're referring to a rabbit, then it was probably, you know, post-medieval, we just bury it in. Done.
No. Chicken. I'm still sad about it.
Again, because while some introductions are attributed to the Romans, because it's probably when we're finding them in larger numbers, but then, like, it wouldn't be outside the realms of possibility that much earlier on, a chicken made its way to Britain. You're like, you know, some merchant saying, look at this weird thing I've got.
Yeah.
But then, you know, nothing came of it and they weren't systematically being kept. Or maybe they were and we're not finding them. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, what is the saying? That I think 90% of the archaeological record, like, is already destroyed?
Yep.
Just through, you know, like, taphonomic factors of things just decaying in the ground. And, well, especially, you know, all the organic material, like a lot of the wood. And so that would have been just gone.
Yeah.
For a long, long, long time. So we're only through archaeology and archaeological excavation, you only discover like that one portion. It's a bit like you're doing a puzzle of 1,000 pieces and you find 10. All from the different corners, and you've got to somehow fill up the blanks and trying to get a picture as accurate and unbiased as you can.
Yeah, and that's where these arbitrary time periods make sense. You know, if we have only 10 pieces of the jigsaw, it would make sense for you to start going, okay, I'm just going to start referring to them as, you know, the north corner, like the south corner, the east and the west, or whatever, like very arbitrary kind of categories just to help orientate yourself.
But also, like, in a more, I guess, Iron Age specific example, you have throughout Europe various cultures that have been identified and named. of course, the name would not have been the name of this culture. And again, within sort of what we're broadly calling that culture, there would have been several different tribes or society, whichever societal structure they would have had, that maybe, they had things in common, but might have been substantially different in terms of their belief system or particular crafts and industries. It's just that we're trying, those that have the most similar sort of traits, we group them together and saying it's this culture. But again, that also tends to be a way to sort of make it easier to, identify maybe the finds from populations confined within a particular geographical region, or maybe they had similar ways in which they built their structures or the material culture they produced.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that they were necessarily, the same people. They might have been linked, they might have been trading, but that didn't mean they were all the same people.
No, exactly. And the thing is that the later prehistoric period is actually a great time for these kind of questions to be asked, because guess what? We don't really know a lot about the later prehistoric in Britain, because why would we?
Because they didn't write anything down. How inconsiderate.
Exactly. Listen, if you're in the past, write everything down so that our jobs are 10 times easier. I'm tired. I'm tired of trying to figure out things.
Yeah, so what I really want to see is that at the bottom of your Iron Age storage jar, I just want it etched, saying this vessel was hand-built under a full moon and then fired in a clam kiln on a Wednesday. What's a Wednesday? I don't know.
It's probably important for the people to read this later on, though.
Spoilers.
But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is most distinct about, or the lack thereof is so distinct about the later prehistoric period is, things like funerary practices. There's a whole chapter in my PhD about this. It's extremely problematic because we don't have consistency in the way human remains and rites occur. So for the most part, especially the late Iron Age, just kind of is invisible. There's they literally refer to it as the invisible dead, that we don't know. We don't have as many bodies. We don't know what's happening. You seem to kind of go from that kind of formal burial, what we all consider burials. And then you have bodies that are just kind of dumped in ditches. And then you have remains that are put in the threshold of dwellings, like juveniles. And yeah, the Iron Age is wild, honestly.
Because again, I guess it wouldn't be that consistent, because again, you would have had so many different cultures that again might have been in contact and might have been trading, but they were all sort of doing their own thing. So maybe so some people would just dump their dead in a ditch, and others would have more formal burial practices, because then just because it's the same time period and roughly the same geographical region, it doesn't mean that people would have had the same approach to mortality. Because maybe in some belief system, I mean, it might have been that the person was dumped in a ditch because he'd done something wrong and wasn't considered worthy of a decent burial, or it might have just been that that particular culture maybe didn't ascribe, I don't know whether that's the right term, much to the body of the deceased, because okay, that's not them anymore, they're gone, that's just their flesh prison, and they didn't assign much value to it. They would have all had different approaches to death.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then that ends up disrupting the kind of approach that we all have as archaeologists, where realistically, it would be great if all these things were very cut and dry and neat for us to kind of understand. But the truth of it is that humans are messy, and particularly groups of humans are messy. So we have a very diverse kind of funerary record for the later prehistoric, which on one hand is exciting because any work that's being done in it, you're kind of just doing your own thing, and at least for me personally, kind of making it up as you go along. But it's exciting, it's cool. It's just extremely frustrating.
It's good to find sort of links. So in a way, okay, you have different sort of burial practices going throughout, but then it's great to see, so there's these settlements in this particular geographical region that does this, and also like this one over there. So like, of course, because we know so little about it, it's great to be able to establish links and trying to figure out why that is.
Yeah.
Even though, of course, frustratingly, it may have also been that, you know, it's that thing that if you have had an idea and you think it's a brilliant idea, chances are someone has already done it.
Yeah.
In a way that we're humans, we come up with the same things independently.
Exactly.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. The good thing, though, to be a bit more positive for once on this podcast, is even if we do have this kind of, you know, obscurity around a lot of aspects of the later prehistoric, we do also have a rich archaeological record in a lot of other perspectives. And one of the interesting things, especially coming from a zooarchaeological perspective, is we are starting to see that human-animal relationship be a bit more established. So at this point, you know, agriculture has been practiced for thousands of years. And we start to see, I mean, obviously this has always existed, but I feel like in the later prehistoric in particular, and when you have these settlement sites where people have been staying for long periods of time, you get to see a bit more of that relationship kind of being established and growing. And I feel like, I'm going to say it, folks, everyone get ready with your bingo cards. You especially see this when it comes to ritual. Yep. Just mark that down. Ritual, we got it, folks. But you see an increased inclusion of domesticated animals into these deposits from the Neolithic onwards. So there's something very interesting there in terms of, you know, what's going on with these relations. Again, like, obviously animals have always been kind of pretty important in human life, but it's particularly interesting from that perspective of, well, we've now been living with these animals for ages.
Yeah, because I guess they would have become maybe perhaps increasingly important. I mean, there's also the thing to bear in mind that we do have more data to go with compared to earlier time periods. Of course, there'll be that bias there, but yes, you do tend to see more. So is it because they had an increasingly sort of expanding relationship with the animals? Is it because were they perhaps wealthier, meaning that they had more animals to spare for pure ritualistic purposes? Mm-hmm. Or did their belief system substantially change? And you see that reflected in the archaeological record. Or all of these, or none of these. It's prehistory.
As we ponder these big questions, or my brain, you know, melts from these big questions, I think we should...
All this pondering.
Listen, my life is 90% pondering and 10% being tired from pondering. So let's ponder some more off mic.
T-shirts, please.
Yes. T-shirts. And we'll take a break and we'll get back to it after this.
Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ANIMALS.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Back to school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop tax-free August 2nd through 6th and save up to 70% off the latest school styles. The best of apparel, footwear, accessories, and more. Save at Nike Factory Store, American Eagle, Gap Outlet, Crocs, Under Armour, Banana Republic Factory, and hundreds more. There's always something happening. Discover the latest fun and events all season long. Tanger Outlets, your savings destination.
Welcome back to Archaeo Animals. We are doing our second episode of our Time Warp series, and we're talking about the later prehistoric, mostly in Britain, but, we'll try.
Pretty much entirely in Britain.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine.
No,
we don't have any bias.
What's a bias?
Clearly. But
No.
No. I've never heard the word. No. But yeah, and we're gonna break down the periods a bit more, which I think will be helpful, especially since we spent the first segment basically talking about how difficult the later prehistoric is.
And just anything prehistoric, for that matter.
This is true. Yes, when you lack written records and things like that, you really get your work cut out for you,
But isn't it all the more rewarding?
I mean, I haven't seen that part yet, but I'll wait. It'll come eventually. As Simona said so eloquently in the first part, we start with the Bronze Age. Technically, kind of the late Bronze Age.
Yeah, so it's really only about 300 years worth of Bronze Age, because like 1000 BC to 700 BC. So only about 300 years worth of Bronze Age. Not an awful lot. Just a touch of Bronze Age.
Again, that's all you need, a touch of Bronze Age.
A touch of Bronze Age. It seems like the name of a perfume. Touch of Bronze Age.
That could be something we could get into, like a perfume, like that must exist, right? Like a perfume company that does scents based on time periods, like archaeologically.
No, it's just an infusion of our tears.
I mean, that would be accurate. But I mean, I can imagine being like, you have, I don't know, like peat moss and hearth smells. This is why I'm not doing this as a side business. But you know what I mean? I feel like that would be kind of cool.
I know. I feel like if you're talking about, most time periods, if you really want to capture the scent of an agricultural settlement, you'll probably be manure.
Yeah.
Museums are trying to do that now because they're trying to give you sort of sensory experiences, some of them. And I know it's a bit of a leap in terms of time period. But there's a museum in York, is that the Jorvik Viking Centre?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, is that Jorvik?
That has the little ride through like the reconstructed Viking settlement at Coppergate, and it stinks, as it should. Because if you get the full sensory experience of what it would have been like to be sort of in a very crowded settlement where you'd routinely keep livestock probably in your house. I mean, you definitely did in Tudor times. People would keep cows in the house. It doubles up as heating. Exactly.
No, and I feel like, because I've always been very interested in kind of that sensory exploration, especially someone who does a lot of work in caves where you're kind of forced to experience what likely people in the past were experiencing, because the cave environment doesn't really change after thousands of years. But I feel like scents are not as well explored as, say, a lot of the more visual and sound aspects, or taste. I mean, I know that there's like experimental archaeology, but come on. Let's lick some more pottery sherds, folks.
But I guess it's not as easily quantifiable. In a way similar with sound. I mean, there has been some work in sound, and I do think it's fascinating, especially sort of in caves or sort of prehistoric megaliths and such, to sort of explore the idea of sound and how sometimes in some places, if you stand in a particular location and you say something, your voice is heard sort of almost distorted on the other side of it. It is fascinating, but I guess somewhat harder to quantify than how much pottery you found.
Yeah, but who likes counting in numbers anyway?
I do.
Well,
except no one ever but me.
That's not surprising. Anyway, let's if we're going to talk about the scents and aromas of the later prehistoric, you might as well start with the Bronze Age, where at this point agriculture pretty established, more or less. So that's probably the most prevalent craft and industry at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, because there would have still been some hunting and fishing, but of course agriculture sort of got the pole position. So of course, like...
Your hunting and fishing is more, at this point, supplementary. And that's kind of the the way that shift works. As more people turn to agriculture, you start to see, hunting and fishing tends not to really be your main source of subsistence, depending on where you are, obviously, and, whether or not there's a famine going on, things like that. But broadly speaking,
it tends to be to supplement agriculture. Because agriculture, in the broad sense of the term, gives me and animal husbandry gives you pretty much all you need, because you've got your crop and you've got your livestock, which keep you warm. They can give you oil to keep your dwelling lit at night. It gives you meat, of course, and it also does a lot of the work for you.
Yeah, it gives you a friend.
And a friend.
Yeah, very important. I don't think our zooarchaeologists think enough about how maybe these people were friends with their cows. That's my hot take.
Yeah, I mean, they might have had indeed like their favourite cow.
Yeah, as we all do.
It still happens to this day. I mean, like even in present day, while again agriculture is an industry, so like the livestock will be reared, say for meat. It does happen, that a farmer will take liking to one particular animal and they'll never see an abattoir, because no, they just really like that cow. They're just going to keep it, and when it's too old, they just retire it. It still happens.
Yeah, no, exactly. More things change, more things stay the same, as they say. But as we said, most of these species that are the main focus of these periods, at least zooarchaeologically speaking, are these domesticated species. So as we were just talking about, you have cattle, you have sheep. Cattle rearing was pretty popular despite the massive deforestation which was taking place in the Bronze Age. You could keep cattle actually quite well in woodland, unlike sheep, which were primarily raised for wool. But as Simona was saying, there are many other uses for these animals: meat, manure, milk. It's a multi-purpose animal.
That's the thing, and you're not necessarily going to find that in the archaeological record, because of course, how do you prove that they were using sheep manure? I mean, they were.
Yeah.
How do you prove it? Same with milk and cheese, and of course, in certain, like usually warmer countries, more than warmer, less damp, drier countries, where archaeological material does tend to preserve a little bit better, you do tend to find more evidence for dairy. I mean, not that there are none in this country, it's just it seems to be a little bit more difficult for things to preserve. So, of course, again, like proving that, well, I guess in terms of using sheep or any animal for milk, really, I guess one way you could ascertain that is, of course, looking at the kill rate.
Yeah.
So, of course, if you've got an assemblage of sheep bones and you try to establish, especially if you've got, well, not so much maybe epiphyseal fusion, like ideally you'd want cranial element, you'd want a jaw and maxilla. So, but looking at tooth wear, you can establish roughly the age of death of the animal. And depending on so like if you like gather all this data about all the animals of, all the particular species that you're looking at, and you put it into a nice little graph, you can look roughly what the kill pattern is. To say all the sheep on this site tend to be very old, or they are the opposite, so they are quite young. Because if a sheep was slaughtered when he was quite old, it is likely that it was used for milk and wool, because of course you want to keep them alive as much as possible, so you get as much product out of them as you can. And then when it gets to the stage where the animal, I guess it will still be producing this product, but isn't as productive, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't become economical to keep them alive anymore, and they get dispatched. I mean, it's not unlike what happened, maybe not in the Bronze Age, but, what definitely happened in history and still happens today, say with layers, with hens, because they will lay for most of their life, but after the first few years, the number of eggs produced considerably decreases. So depending on the type of business, they will be culled at that stage, because it's not as economical to keep them alive for the lower amount of eggs that they will produce.
Yeah.
And of course, that would have much been the same in the Bronze Age, maybe not with chickens, because probably not a thing. yet at that time, but it would have certainly been the case for sheep or for cattle. And as I said, going back to my previous point, if you have your data set and you see that all the sheep are slaughtered when quite young, it's likely that they were used for meat instead.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, in spite of all the graphs you can do, that things are still tricky, because a lot of the sheep, a lot of the livestock that were kept back then would have most likely been multi-purpose.
Exactly.
Like even today, again, on farms, you do get some specific breeds that have been developed, for wool or for meat or milk. But then you also still have dual-purpose breeds that say, like, they finish off quite nicely if you're rearing them for meat, but they're also quite productive in terms of milk or wool.
Yeah.
Not as straightforward. Yeah.
Well, and then, of course, you have the kind of less utilitarian uses. One of the very odd things about the later prehistoric in general, but also in the Bronze Age, is you have a lot of threshold deposits. And one of the things is you can find many juvenile sheep within or around the threshold of roundhouses. And these kind of deposits you see a lot, say, in a couple of examples are the Kelsey Caves, of course, which are my sites. And Broxmouth Hill Fort in Scotland as well has several deposits at its entrances of both human and animal remains. So again, you have that kind of trickiness of, not everything is also very utilitarian, at least in the way we think of using animals.
Although, again, it depends, because we know next to nothing about their belief system, even though the deposition is not apparently utilitarian, they may well have thought that it was, because, say, like, again, this is not scientific, this is just me making an example out there, just to prove a point. Say that in the Bronze Age, they would put lambs as threshold deposits because they believed that they would ward off evil spirits.
Yeah.
I'm just saying completely something wild out there to make a point. While it doesn't seem apparently utilitarian, if you're, according to your belief system, making that action will actually result in whatever, sort of leaving you alone, that suddenly becomes very utilitarian for you.
Yeah, I mean, I only use the term utilitarian to kind of, it's hard to differentiate, I feel like, through words, because like you say, what seems not quote unquote practical, that's the word I always see a lot, is like practicality. When, of course, as you say, if it's in your belief system, then it's 100% practical for you to, say, bury a lamb underneath your entrance of your roundhouse, But it's a good point to also kind of reiterate for others is, you can't really differentiate like that. Again, ritual is everything ultimately. So it's hard to be very neat about these categories.
Absolutely, because again, we're making inferences about people whose belief system, again, we know next to nothing about.
Exactly. Continue that. We move into the Iron Age, which again, still a bit iffy, but I think there's a bit more here, especially when it comes to animals.
Yes, a bit more clarity. Again, probably a lot more sites, so like a larger data set to work with. Mind you, like a lot of it, I believe it is transitional with the Roman period, mind you. I guess the one thing that strikes me about the Iron Age was the use of iron, which
striking iron,
is that it does tend to be quite varied in terms of material culture and artifactual evidence across the country. Because, like, for instance, you see places like the southeast, which is essentially Romanized in the later Iron Age already, mostly owing to trade networks. So, for example, that you might see Italian ceramic vessels in Iron Age context in southern England.
Yeah.
Because, of course, the trade from the continent coming from Brittany and then later also from Gaul once Caesar had occupied it.
Yeah.
So we should see the southeastern of the country being quite Romanized, but then there'll be parts, you say, going on the opposite side of it in the southwest, and parts like Cornwall, who won't be Romanized for a long time, if at all Romanized, really. or, parts of Scotland.
Yeah.
Of course, and the north. So you do see quite a bit of variation, which will extend then later on to the Romano-British period, because again, some parts of the country will continue living as they always have. Okay, so these blokes are in charge now. Grand. I'm still gonna, tend to my livestock and make my bread and all that, and I'll go to bed and then it starts again. You know.
But speaking of the Romans, we do have to give them credit because, as you say, this is a weird transitional period with a bit of an overlap. So you kind of see that with the zooarchaeological record because earliest chicken in Britain, baby. I think still.
As of the 16th,
I feel like it's always changing. That's the problem.
It's the earliest chicken in Britain.
Yeah. Well, this is okay. Let me just put a disclaimer that this is, I think, current because obviously, especially with the Chicken Project, Naomi Sykes's amazing, gigantic project, we're always finding new information. I feel like this date gets getting pushed back every 3 years. But as of now, at least from what I understand, the earliest chicken in Britain from White Horse Stone in Aylesford, Kent. So it's very rare to find chicken remains in sites prior to the Roman-British period. Only 30% of Iron Age assemblages from South England have domestic fowl. But this is probably the earliest one. But it's still probably also likely a Roman-British import.
As are most things. I mean, just to touch briefly on the other species that were kept. I mean, it's not that much different, as in they would have still kept sheep, although they do become a bit less prevalent in the Iron Age onwards, mostly replaced by cattle. So you sort of see people really loving cattle, and then cattle sort of dwindles down and sheep become more popular, and then sheep sort of get less popular again. You see pigs popping up. I mean, they're not uncommon, but they're not common. And they do tend to be seen mostly as a high status animal, given that, because you need a fair amount of land to raise them. And of course, it is fairly uneconomical to keep, because while sheep and cattle and that, they will give you other products, pigs will just eat your food until it's time to finish them. Of course, that would also explain why mostly, and then again, not just in the later prehistoric period, I think it's across the board, a lot of the pigs found in archaeological context, and again, nowadays, tend to be subadults.
Yeah.
Because even though they still got a little room to grow, the very little they grow will not justify the extra amount of resources you'd have to employ to feed the huge amounts that they eat. Now, in terms of cattle, interestingly, cattle does pop up a fair amount in burial mounds, and it is also frequently found as a motif in both British and European domestic objects. And as we said before, cattle does tend to be a little bit more prevalent, again, because it can be used for several purposes. You can use them for meat, milk, cheese, leather, of course, the good old manure, and I guess, horses. I mean, I guess not unlike pigs, horses are expensive to keep. So they'll be used in warfare and hunting, and generally seen as high status, because again, they're quite expensive to keep. And in terms of sort of mortality rate, you do tend to see that the horses tend to be on the older side of things, because horses are expensive. That should go in the bingo. So if you acquire enough resources to have one, you will keep it alive for as long as you can.
Yep. And I think we will stop for now and kind of continue on and then get into our case studies in the next segment.
You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show.
And we are back with Archaeo Animals, and we are talking about the Zooarchaeology of the Later Prehistoric as part of our Time Warped mini-series. And before we get into our case notes, just kind of end our conversation from the last segment, because I realized we didn't actually talk about any wild species. Which, to be fair, there's a lot to talk about with the domesticated animals. So I feel like we get a pass on that.
Yeah, no, I think I did go off on one on sort of mortality rates and sort of kill ratios.
But we love that. That's what we love about you, Simona. I was just shocked that it wasn't really about Romans. But
no, it's just like, for a change, I'm going into details about when animals get dispatched.
Listen, variety is the spice of life. But, oh, hi, Bastet. Yeah, so ironically, though, even though we need to touch upon wild species in the Iron Age, there actually isn't that much to really talk about because they weren't as prevalent in the zooarchaeological record, and neither are fish remains, which is actually a huge debate still kind of ongoing among Iron Age zooarchaeologists, because obviously, absence of what's the phrase?
Absence of evidence is an evidence of absence.
There you go. Just because we have an absence of fish remains doesn't mean that everyone was, not eating fish. And fish are also very tricky because obviously they're very often small bones, often very fragile bones. So you already kind of have this lack of fish remains in your average site. But there is this kind of idea that maybe there could have been a taboo on eating fish, as there is a very distinct lack of fish remains across many Iron Age sites. But it's also clearly not a blanket cultural characteristic, which obviously we could say about a lot of these things. But we do find significant fishing remains at a lot of other Iron Age sites, particularly in the Northern Isles, like the Orkney Islands and Shetland, and places that are mainland in Scotland, like Brocksmith Hill Fort. So just want to touch upon that, mostly because that was basically what my master's thesis was about, and I would feel bad if we didn't talk about it. Anyway.
I guess now moving onto the segment that we've decided it's everyone's favourite. We just make the decision for everyone.
Yeah, no one's ever said that this is their favorite segment, but I don't care. It is your favorite segment now.
Well, it's Bastet's favourite segment.
No. Oh.
But yeah, so we'll be talking about case studies. Now, the first one is one that you would have probably heard before, but it's cool. So we're going to do it again. And that is Must Farm and Flag Fen.
Yes.
Of course, Must Farm being more like, the name of the project, and Flag Fen being the site.
Yeah.
It's a late Bronze Age settlement that is, it's in the name, it's at the edge of the Fens, so in the east of England. And it's along the river Nen, or Neen, if you're wrong. And it is presumed that the settlement has burned down within 6 months of its construction, which is real unlucky for them, but real lucky for us, because the site was, of course, abandoned as was, thus giving us a very exciting glimpse into everyday late Bronze Age life. Part of the reason why, in case you're wondering why it's been argued that the settlement was so short-lived, is the absence of synanthropic insect species. So these are insect species which pretty much rely on human occupation to survive or thrive. We've mentioned them before. I'm not sure if any of you remember a good old friend, the general Cytophilus granarius, a humble friend, a grain weevil. He is one of the synanthropic species because without humans, it's pretty much stuffed.
And I think he's also our podcast mascot?
It definitely is now. I believe did we get some fan art?
We do. I believe we have some fan art. Yeah, if you're on Instagram, if you go on my Instagram profile at Archaeology Fits, don't really follow me because I'm not very exciting. But I do have a kind of highlight saved of fan art that people have made for the show, which is still so wild. And we are so thankful that people have listened longer than 2 minutes of this podcast.
We're so thankful and undeserving of your time.
Exactly. That said, if you have some fan art for some reason, again, we are so thankful, but also send it to me on Instagram. I'd be happy to highlight it. It's just great. It makes me feel warm inside, which is hard because I'm a very cold-hearted person. Anyway.
I mean, not right now. It is pretty hot.
It is. No, I'm boiling.
But that brings us back, in a way, to the point that you made about sort of the absence of something from the archaeological record. I mean, the absence of the synanthropic species from Flag Fen is also an interesting reminder how the absence of a certain species can be just as significantly important as their presence.
Yes.
Because, of course, due to the lack of sort of these particular species, they could ascertain that the site had not been settled for long enough for these species to sort of let themselves in. Because they definitely were not invited in. They let themselves in. Just rude. But yeah, it's a major site that's super interesting because of the stunning preservation of the organic material. Because again, because of its particular location at the edge of the fens, there is some waterlogging going on, as you'd expect, combined with, of course, the charring of the remains due to it, burning down. And going back to fish once more, there is, for it being, other indicators about the presence of a certain species, other than the bones themselves, when it comes to fish on Flag Fen, there wasn't really any fish remains recovered from site, but we do know they did fish because during the excavations, they have discovered fish wares and eel traps made out of wicker.
Oh, okay.
So while no actual fish were found, we know they were being fished and, eaten probably. So, again, not only the absence of a particular species is important, but also sometimes other artifactual evidence other than the bones themselves can tell you that some species were indeed present on the settlement. And again, the presence of sheep and dogs, remains were found, but their presence was also implied by preserved coprolites.
Ooh,
AKA poo.
I was just thinking, I don't think we've really talked a lot about coprolites on this show.
Because again, it's just something so rare to come across, because it needs to be in a pretty sort of anaerobic conditions for that to preserve, unless you go way, way, way back before the time of archaeology, where it's completely fossilized and it's stone. But when it's still a bit gooey, then it kind of needs a fair few factors for it to preserve across millennia.
Yeah.
And once again, some of the evidence recovered from this site, I guess the various phases of this sort of huge site, brings us back to one of the points that we mentioned about the later Bronze Age and deposits at thresholds of dwellings, because we do find both lambs and calves within the thresholds of roundhouses.
Yeah.
But there seems to be an interesting distinction between sort of domesticates and wild species, because you do seem to find, the domesticates sort of more in the domestic sphere, sort of in these threshold deposits, while wild animals, chiefly wild boar and deer, will be found outside the dwellings.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
And what's also quite interesting about this remains of wild species is that they're in proportionally higher quantities than what you'd expect from a contemporary site.
Oh.
Several theories have been thrown around thrown around. They've been developed through research, not just as to why that could have been the case. One of the reasons that was suggested is because, of course, the fens are pretty much a wetland environment.
Yeah.
It's perhaps not as well suited to rearing domesticates. So like sheep, for example, they would struggle quite a bit given the conditions and would probably develop diseases such as foot rot.
Yum.
No, not for them it was. Thus, in a way, making hunting more prevalent.
Yeah, I guess.
And again, a lot of fishing taking place, clearly. Although I was mistaken, fish was recovered from site, but in very, very small quantities. And the occasional pike. Mm-hmm. But again, we know they were fishing.
Yeah, that's kind of the case for a lot of sites that I've worked on that have been kind of roped into this conversation over whether or not there was a fish taboo in places in the Iron Age. where you do get some fish remains, and then you have that kind of conversation of like, oh, is this proof of, again, like a famine or something, some kind of issue where they were forced to kind of, supplement their subsistence strategies with fishing. And I mean, again, it is all theories ultimately, but the kind of artifactual record kind of suggests that no, they were probably fishing. It's just fish bones are the worst, and we all hate them.
Yeah, and of course, in more inland settlements, maybe at certain points in time, it wouldn't have been as economical to import fish in.
Exactly. Yeah. So, it varies, and there's a lot of contextual aspects to kind of consider. But
so again, like a lot of the sites where you seem to be finding fish, even in the Iron Age, I mean, most of the ones that you've mentioned are sort of coastal sites, and even like places by like Flack Fen, it's not that far from the Nen.
Yeah.
So again, like while, I mean, it's not unduly far from the sea, but of course you've got the river that's fairly close by, there will be some fishing.
Yeah, I guess it really just depends. It is hard. I find that I struggle with this sometimes as well, especially when you're looking at the zooarchaeological record and you're trying to figure out, in particular, like kind of weird sites where you're like, oh, some of this might be more natural deposits rather than human-induced deposits. Trying to figure out like, oh, would they go through the trouble of going that far to fish or whatever? But yeah, it is interesting to consider. And I just realized that actually our second site for the case studies kind of makes like a really interesting not parallel, but like a comparison to Musk Farm and everything, because it has way worse preservation, but a similar kind of story in terms of, that absence of material. And I'm going to apologize now because I'm going to pronounce everything wrong. Unless do you know how all these pronunciations go?
Carn Euny?
Is it Carn Euny? That's what I thought it was. But yeah, Carn Euny is a Iron Age village in the southwest of England. As we said, lots and lots of Iron Age stuff in the southeast and southwest of England. And it was occupied until the Roman occupation of Britain. It was a very domestic site, which you'll see in the mammal representation. And it's mostly known for its fugu.
I think it's a very, because Carn Euny is in Cornwall.
Yeah,
and I think fugus are a very Cornish thing that I think still puzzles archaeologists to this day as to why. I mean, it's cool, but why? It's
cool. It's also the first time I've ever actually heard of it, which I guess makes sense. There's only apparently 15 surviving ones in Britain, at least 15 like confirmed surviving ones. Obviously, there's loads that haven't been really confirmed yet, because a fogu is a underground passage with side chambers. So a little bit of criteria there for archaeologists to kind of base their interpretations on. And they're mostly seen in the Iron Age and the Roman period. I think there's very rarely any fogu that have been first constructed in the late Iron Age. So something like that. And then the houses in this Iron Age village are referred to as courtyard houses, which is another thing I actually never heard of as someone who mostly works in Scotland, where it's just hill forts and round houses, baby. So courtyard houses are basically, there's a wall surrounding an open courtyard, and then you have like a roundhouse built in. I'm also very bad at architecture and archaeology, so maybe that's why I don't know. I hadn't heard of this.
I mean, aside from the roundhouse built in it, it sounds very Roman.
Yeah.
To have like a dwelling with a central open courtyard.
I guess that kind of fits into that like weird transitional period that it took place in.
Yeah, but again, like Carn Euny was settled during sort of the early Roman period as well, so you probably have some overlap, and of course we'll get to that in a minute, because there isn't a lot of material available on this site. I mean, it's likely that there would have been multiple phases to the settlement. This was my idea to cover this, because while the podcast in general is very Britain-centric, I do find it that it's specifically England-centric most of the time. So it's good to integrate sort of studies and sites from sort of other parts of the country, such as Cornwall, which are so distinct from everywhere else. So there you go. Blame me.
Yeah. Just full disclosure, while we were working on this episode, I got a text from Simona that was just like, is there any zooarchaeology there? Basically. And do you know what? It was a fair question, because there's not really that much going on about the zooarchaeology. The only paper I could find that was published and available online about Carn, the bone report is half a page in the appendices. Apparently, there is a PhD thesis on the animal bones from this site written by someone named R.T. Jones at the University of York in 1977, but I cannot find it online. So if you're out there, please send it to me. I'm very interested now. But the main reason why there's such a lack of this material is because of the soil. It's
because Cornwall.
Yeah, because of Cornwall. But it's such an opposite from our first case study in that, the area is very acidic. So you have a very significant lack of organic materials overall. But I think there's still a lot to discuss and speculate. You kind of actually started talking about it in terms of, what do we do when we have this lack in the zooarchaeological record? And so you kind of have to infer from other aspects of the site. So again, we know that this is more or less a domestic site. So what are the kind of animals will we find here? And, you're probably looking at your sheep, your goat, your cattle, for sure. And then potentially pigs, horses, dogs. So there's a lot of tin nearby, from what I understand. So people at the Somme were likely tin traders. They were likely tin traders. And one of the interpretations kind of going out there is, maybe they traded. If they were tin traders, maybe they also traded for resources as well.
Yeah, because one thing about Cornwall is I think Cornwall was already renowned at the time for their tin.
Yeah.
I think it was like one of the sort of peninsula, almost. Yeah, it's effectively a peninsula. One of their sort of biggest exports would have been their tin.
Yeah, so, kind of considering a trading element with regards to animals. And then the other thing is the fogu itself is very hotly debated in terms of what it was actually used for. So one of the more zooarchaeologically related theories I found is it might have been used as cold storage, or at least kind of general food storage. Although other people say that the fogu is too large to just be used for storage, which in my response to that is you never have a fridge too large for food. Another interpretation was that it was a cow shed, but again, why would you be putting your cows underground? My personal belief is that it's probably ritual.
Yes to all of those things, probably.
And I think that's a good place to end this episode, is to...
Although, one fun fact about Corn, because we did mention that the preservation is quite poor, because unfortunately, the soils in Cornwall do tend to be on the very acidic side.
Yeah,
which of course doesn't lend to good preservation. But one way that you can tell that the soil's very acidic, so one thing that I've noticed is that there seems to be a lot of hydrangeas everywhere.
Okay,
Find them in private gardens, roundabouts. Very popular. Also because hydrangeas, much like azaleas and I believe camellias, if that's how you pronounce it, they all love acidic soils. So in Cornwall, these plants thrive. I've got hydrangeas in my garden. They look, it's fairly acidic. It's clay site where I'm on. But just in Cornwall, they're just so huge and magnificent. The heights they reach is fabulous. The whole of Cornwall is fabulous. So it's just, it just adds to the fabulousness.
And so we'll end our episode with a paid advertisement from Cornwall. I'm so glad we've gotten this kind of sponsorship on this podcast. But yeah, if you don't want to sponsor the episode, but still want to support us, You can find us on Twitter at ArchaeoAnimals. You can find us on Facebook, again, at ArchaeoAnimals. Like and subscribe to our podcast. Leave a review, a nice review, please. I am very fragile. And I think that's it. We'll see you next episode where we'll be, Simona will be by herself talking about the Romans as part of our mini-series.
Sure, why not?
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to ArchaeoAnimals. Please subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you get your podcast from. You can find us on Twitter at ArchaeoAnimals. Also, the views expressed on the podcast are those of ourselves, the hosts and guests, and do not necessarily represent those of our institution, employers, and the Archaeology Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV Traveling America, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.